The idea of this session from young Willem, Duyvendak and myself stems from the need to turn the notion of domopolitics into a useful tool for social research. This notion comes from the background in IR and political geography, pointing out to the variety of ways in which the notion, the emotional notion of home, can be turned into a discursive tool for politics, for policy making, mostly with an exclusionary subtext. Now, the idea is how far that through this notion, the category of home can, in various ways, shift from the private to the public sphere, so from the dwelling to some sort of wider environment of relevance, and from the individual to the collective level. So as a matter of not only how a single person makes his or her home in any place, but how this notion can be reappropriated in a variety of ways by collective actors. And how this notion, as a result, the notion of home, can be instrumentalized in a variety of political agendas and stances that have to do with the relationship with the majorities, with the mainstream, and minorities of all kinds. Can be a matter of migrants, ethnic minorities, or of minorities along lines of sexuality, religion, belonging, and so forth. Now, our idea, consistent with the remit of CES, was to promote a dialogue around these topics between researchers from Europe and the US. The thing is that, on the one hand, in Europe there seems to be much more research on home as a specific topic than in the US. But we believe that this prospect, the domopolitics idea, has a remarkable potential to inform both more research in the US too, and to facilitate cross-country analysis and comparison. So, based on this, what we are going to do today is to advance this session with three contributions. Two of them, the first two by Alejandro, Miranda and Fenneke Wekker, more with an empirical and micro case study, I would say, oriented approach, and the third one, co-authored by young Willem and myself, more of a kind of a theoretical and research agenda on these topics.
Thanks. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alejandro Miranda. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Trento, the Department of Sociology and Social Research. We're currently working in a large ERC, fairly large ERC project. We're about 7 researchers doing primarily ethnographic work, but also we use all the techniques to understand the home migration nexus. That is, we're trying to understand migrant ways of homing using a multi-sided and comparative framework, and we try to understand, among many other things, how the physical, relational, and emotional basis of home are reproduced over space, and how pre-existing home cultures are affected by transnational migration. So one of the issues that I've been dealing with in my work in this project has to do with home as a socially constructed scale. That is, home that can be within the domestic space, but also beyond the domestic space. So the paper that I'm going to present today, it has to do with this matter of scale. How homemaking practices in particular can extend beyond domestic spaces. So I've been conducting fieldwork in Madrid and Milan so far, and I found several ways of feeling and doing home, or making home, between migrants and non-migrants. And these practices, they take place in private, semi-public, public, and communal spaces. So for this presentation, I'm going to focus on a case that I've been documenting in Madrid. And I'm discussing what I've called provisionally domopolitics, or everyday domopolitics, in relation to the ways in which migrants and non-migrants use public spaces. So the idea of this this paper is to discuss or enhance the discussion on the thresholds of domesticity and foreignness, distinctions between insiders and outsiders, and political dimensions of interacting in, moving across, and arranging public space. So Madrid, like many of the capitals, Madrid is a city of migration for most of its history. For centuries, it has received people from many places in Spain, and it has also expelled a lot of people to other countries and continents. For example, in the southwest of the city, in the neighborhoods of Lucero and Latina, these places have a road that connects Extremadura with the southwest of the city. Extremadura is a region that is neighboring with Portugal, very poor, and they produce very good jamón. So these migrants, people from this region, they migrated to the city throughout the 20th century and even before, and they settled in the southwest of the city. So I've been talking to people from these neighborhoods, and they told me a lot of stories, how they migrated, particularly elder people. They told me, oh yeah, we're right here, we were living in one-story houses, and the roads were dirt roads, and we saw these neighborhoods come up. Now we have buildings and we have infrastructure. So they tell me stories about these places, and there are the fiestas populares, the popular festivities in the region of the city. And there are stands of people from different regions. So you have, in the fiestas populares, you have the stand from Andalusia, the stand from Extremadura, the stand from Galicia, from different places, and they keep their ways of cooking, their dances, and their traditions. And they display them in public space. So that has happened throughout the 20th century. But more recently, about 2 decades ago, there has been a significant increase in international migration, mostly from Eastern Europe, from China, and from Latin America. So in my ethnographic work, I'm focusing on Latin American migrants, and specifically on Peruvian and Ecuadorian migrants. For this paper, I'm just going to talk about Ecuadorians in Madrid. In Madrid, there are currently more than 100,000 Ecuadorians living in this city, although the numbers fluctuate quite rapidly, because many of them acquire permanent residency after a few years, and then they take the Spanish citizenship. So many times they're counted as Spaniards, although in practice, in their everyday life, in public space, they are seen, perceived, and treated as outsiders. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Ecuadorians are the third largest group of immigrants in the city, just after Romanians and the Chinese. And the idea is that these different waves of migration, internal and international migration, they have reconfigured the public space. The uses that people give to these spaces reconfigure the life in the city. So public parks are one of the most contested spaces. They are spaces of encounter and friction because of the uses that people give to these areas. So in early 2000s, many Ecuadorian migrants and other Latin Americans, more generally speaking, they started using the parks as a place of recreation with a very distinct festive ambiance. So people play football and a particular kind of volleyball that I'm going to describe in a second, called equavolley. There were stands selling traditional food from South America, but that was street food vending, which is not allowed in the city of Madrid. It's illegal. People consumed alcohol very often, and there were hairdressing stands as well, so people could go and have a haircut. Something very new in Spain. It happens only in indoors. It doesn't happen outdoors. That is a very Latin American way of doing things. And people were selling pirated CDs and DVDs later on. I'm talking about early 2000s now. So many of the Ecuadorians that I've met, and they told me these stories, they live in, I visited their houses, and they live in rather precarious conditions. They share accommodation very often, and they live several families in the same flat, 1, 2, 3 families in the same flat. So when you don't feel very comfy at home, when you don't have enough space, you need to compensate with public spaces. So what people did in the early 2000s in the parks, well, they had naps in the parks. The weather in Madrid affords it. It's quite nice most of the year. It doesn't rain much, so it's very dry, so people had these spaces available. They met friends and family. They spent time for socializing, exchanging information. Parks became a very important place for exchanging information among migrants. So there were two parks that received excuse me. There were two parks that received most of the attention in the media because of the size of the concentration. There were hundreds and hundreds of people concentrating on Saturdays and Sundays. So it's Casa de Campo, which is a park in the west side of the city, and Parque del Retiro, which is another one in the east. However, there were many little parks and sport recreational facilities that were intensely used by Ecuadorians on weekends. And they were playing a game that is called equavolley. So equavolley is a variant of volleyball. It's very popular in Ecuador and also abroad where there are Ecuadorians. Each team is composed by 3 players instead of 6, as in standard volleyball. The size of the court is exactly the same, but the net is placed much higher. So that puts a different way of playing. Also, the techniques for playing at the ball is not a standard volleyball ball, but it's a soccer ball. They use a football, the same ball that you use for playing soccer. So this is a very recreational activity. It is performed in improvised spaces, in pretty much any space that is relatively flat, in which they can put 2 poles and 1 net, and that's it. And they demarcate the court with a rope, because you don't have the chance to paint on the street or whatever. So you put a rope to demarcate this area. So there are some tournaments and competitions, more or less formal, but in general, this activity is a recreational activity. So it's a way of spending the weekend with friends and family, and it's associated with alcohol consumption, street food vending, and gambling particularly as well. Games, there's a lot of gambling in the games. So imagine yourself, you're a migrant, you're foreign in the space, it's been a couple of years that you arrived, and then you find that these spaces welcome you, and you go there, you have a drink with your friends, there's a stand there, 2 or 3 women are selling the dishes that you know from all your life, with the spicy food that they do, and you can play your game, and you have a really good time. So people really have a good time in these spaces. It's a really good way of spending a Saturday afternoon, and it's affordable. It's cheaper than going to the movies or other things. So equavolley in Spain is mostly played by Ecuadorians. That is, it has a nationalistic connotation as well. I've met people who are not from Ecuador originally and play this game, but mostly because they're married to Ecuadorians. So there's a national component, a nationalistic component in this game. So the festive ambiance that I was telling you about in these occasions, in these spaces, was not very well seen by old neighbors, what they call the old neighbors, by people who lived around these parks or lived in these areas. A lot of people that I've been interviewing, hanging out with in my ethnography, they told me a distinction between old neighbors and new neighbors. Old neighbors as an euphemism to talk about the people who lived there most of their lives in the same neighborhood, but mostly Spaniards and mostly Madrileños, people from the city of Madrid. But it had different shades, so different connotations. So it's a bit flexible, but still it has that meaning. And new neighbors were used mostly for immigrants, but not only, also for people from other regions of Spain who arrived recently in the same neighborhood. So I'm talking about a very micro level here, the level of the street, how people distinguish between one and the other. It's not politically correct to talk about immigrants or saying, oh, they are foreign, they are South Americans or whatever. It's better to call them new neighbors. And also from the new neighbors, that was the distinction, the old neighbors. So street food vending is tightly regulated in Madrid. It is illegal and it is problematic because the regulation in the parks is very tight. People shouldn't make fires in these spaces. Madrid is a very dry city, so there's a risk of producing fires. So the problems rapidly escalated when the municipality in the early 2000s decided to tackle this problem in a punitive way. They sent police, and policemen arrived violently. They took the utensils of people cooking there. They took the bottles of alcohol, dispersed the groups, and many street food vendors reacted violently as well because these utensils were the means of subsistence that they had. They were working in there, and that's the only thing they had. So, and also the way the municipality reacted, that resonated with a lot of opinions of the old neighbors. That led many times to xenophobic and xenophobic attitudes and many insults in these kind of spaces. So that the initiative of the municipality created or had a resonance in a wider population. So the practice of equavolia, this became stigmatized. The old neighbors and local authorities associated this sport with alcohol consumption, gambling, food bending, and they couldn't differentiate between a family gathering and botellón. Botellón is the local term for binge drinking in the public space. So between 2004 and 2005, putting up a net in Madrid for playing equavolia was forbidden in practice. In theory it wasn't forbidden, but in practice it was forbidden. And that is because there was this association of these kind of activities. So people left the usual parks, the usual neighborhoods, and they went to abandoned factories to reproduce this sense of familiarity in these places. An enthusiast of this sport told me, and I quote, "To me that was a terrible moment because people dressed up on Saturday, but they didn't go to the park of the city. They went to an abandoned factory because that was the only place in which we could gather. I think this is still in the memory of many people living in Madrid, how they were treated at that moment, how the institutions mistreated people." End of quote. So these were the years in which most of the affected districts in the south and some of them in the north, and mostly another one in the east of the city, they were trying to do something. The local administrations tried to do something about this problem, and also the friction that were created in these spaces. And there were also a lot of NGOs advocating for migrant groups who intervened in the negotiations between old and new neighbors. So the argument of the NGOs was pretty straightforward. They said that having healthy leisure is necessary for people living in the city, no matter where you come from. So that was exactly when the first associations of equavolia started to emerge in the city. So many of these enthusiasts of this sport, the migrants, they formed associations. They learned to play the game of the public administration, so they could sit down and negotiate for these public spaces. They were not asking for much. They were asking only for a space in which they could play this game without the police intervening, without violence, without interventions, and they were asking for recognition. They were asking for this activity to be legitimate. And the mediation between the NGOs was very important to create a different attitude among all neighbors. So many spaces emerged for playing this game, specifically, but under certain conditions. No food vending, no alcohol consumption, although moderate consumption was always tolerated. And they keep this, as long as they keep this clean, and there was no noise after an appropriate hour. So when the frictions were eased, and there was apparent negotiation among the different parts, and the old neighbors were finding that it was possible to have this kind of interactions in the public space without much problem, another issue became evident. There were no toilets. So toilets are a necessity in public spaces when people spend several hours in there. So imagine the old neighbors walking their dogs or going for a jog or playing some other sports in the same space, but they do so for a limited amount of hours. But we're talking about these groups of people who spend 7, 8, 10 hours in the public space. They spend the whole Saturday and the whole Sunday gathering there. And the uses of the space are different. So some Spaniards, before they told me that before the crisis of 2008, they adopted, and here I quote, an American way of spending weekends at the shopping mall. So this phrase tells us something about how Spaniards see the way of life in the US. But my point here is that they had shorter interactions in these spaces, short interactions in the park, short interactions in the shopping mall, and so on and so forth. So at the moment, the local municipalities are trying to invest in toilets, but that's also a contested thing. So there has been, in general, a significant change in the way in which this sport has been recognized. And also the ideas of old and new are changing quite rapidly. What were new neighbors in the early 2000s, today there are people who have been living there for 10, 15, 20 years. So in this sense, the ideas of old and new are changing quite rapidly. The local police tactics have changed as well. There are more mediators at the moment, and there are still frictions despite attempts to negotiate these spaces. I was going to give you more examples, but I guess I should wrap it up. So why do I bring this example here? I bring it because there is an ongoing struggle for inclusion and recognition in public spaces. The confrontations for the use and control of these spaces not only arise between new and old neighbors. During the weekdays, for example, these courts of the Equavoli are barely used, but on weekends are used quite a lot, as you can imagine. So for example, a group of kids arrive, and then a group of older kids, like teenagers or whatever, they arrive, and they're more numerous and they're stronger, so the kids have to leave. And so for example, there's a group of women who are part of the local league of Equavoli, and they're playing and they're training on Saturday afternoon, but a group of men, a large group of men arrive and they want to play. So what happens? The women have to leave. So there is an ongoing struggle for the control of these spaces, and there is a tacit understanding of how to operate, what kind of hierarchies exist in these spaces. And that's the interesting thing, how they are negotiated in the everyday life. Of course, the case of women is very interesting because women who play Equavoli, basketball, and also football, they have had access to better places and more spaces as they have become more and more organized. So it's a matter of, it's not only a matter of who's stronger or who's more numerous, it's also a matter of who's better organized. So women have been particularly at the vanguard of these public intervention and public organization in the form of associations, sport associations of immigrants. So this is not a simple conflict of ethnic groups. I don't think it's an ethnic thing, even when people frame it in ethnic terms. So people tell me, oh, you know, these Ecuadorians or these South Americans, or the South Americans tell me, oh, these Spaniards, they don't understand things. There is a framing, but I don't think this is an ethnic conflict. This is about homemaking beyond the house, or I'm framing it in that way. Why framing this phenomenon in terms of home or homing, homemaking? Well, what people are trying to produce in these spaces is familiarity, no matter where you come from. These spaces produce the possibility of anticipating the context, what is going to happen next, in a context where you feel foreign, in a context where you don't feel that you fit quite well. So when you don't feel quite at home, you don't feel quite comfy in your own house because you live in an overcrowded environment with family or friends or strangers, you use public space, and the capacity to feel at home is drawn from the ability to do things in a familiar environment. So these environments, the familiar environments, are not readily available to migrants. Many times they need to create these spaces themselves with the resources they have at hand. So this is the kind of struggle that I'm talking about. So the new neighbors are outsiders who are learning to participate in this public game, and they have formed associations, and they're competing for control of the space and for the capacity to produce familiarity in this space. They're not claiming a home in a park. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that they are trying to make themselves at home in these parks. So the political dimension of this case lies in the unequal capacity to draw a sense of familiarity and control from these recreational facilities. So why do I call it everyday Domopolitics? And I wrap it up with this. Because these, and all the cases that I've seen in different cities, have to do with the seemingly natural distinction between native and migrants, between old neighbors and new neighbors. It has to do with entitlements to public space and the struggles to enact certain practices in public space. This is not about the protection of a homeland, but about the capacity to draw a sense of familiarity and security and control from public space. And I'll leave that.
Thanks very much.
So the paper I will present today is very much work in progress. I was in doubt whether I would present part of my ethnographic fieldwork, which is on making homemaking practice in public space, but I decided to focus on one single case, the case of Willy only. So my research project evolves around various ethnographic cases in which I look into how the Netherlands, the Dutch state, government, municipalities and social organizations, through top-down interventions, attempt to create a sense of home and belonging among fellow residents, and how they try to build local communities. So today I will focus on one social intervention, and specifically on the case of Willy. Willy is one of my respondents, and he's a socially isolated and mentally disabled man in his 50s. And he deeply hates and distrusts neighbors in general. Willy becomes activated by the Municipality of Amsterdam to take part in this neighbors group anyway. So the ethnographic material that I will now present is still very new and fresh to me, so I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments and feedback later. So before turning to Willy's case, I will briefly touch upon the intervention at the core of this ethnographic study. In 2015, the Dutch Social Support Act was established. This act obliges all citizens, all Dutch citizens, to organize their own informal care network before turning to welfare state arrangements. So as part of a comprehensive welfare state retrenchment, vulnerable citizens should now learn how to become as independent as possible from the state and professional help and become more self-reliant. But in response to this new act, social organizations in Amsterdam and other cities have pointed out how difficult it is for people with mental health issues or psychiatric problems to organize an informal care network by themselves. So now, recently in 2016, an additional intervention had been established, where with the help of social organizations and the Municipality of Amsterdam, vulnerable citizens are now guided to create their own informal network amongst themselves, and eventually and hopefully be capable to taking care of each other and become more independent of professional help in the end. So that is the social intervention that I'm focusing on now. Over the last 1.5 years, I've been following 48 vulnerable citizens in Amsterdam who were all targeted by this intervention, who were all activated to take part in a neighbors group in Amsterdam. And Willy was one of them. All of my respondents were clients of one or more of the social organizations that were involved in this intervention. In the end, 34 of my respondents were successfully activated and eventually participated regularly in a neighbors group. 14 of my respondents never participated, never started with a neighbors group due to a deeply ingrained distrust and a rejection of mankind, as one of my respondents explained. So Willy, the person I'm talking about today, is a white Dutch man, 53 years old, and he lives by himself in a one-bedroom apartment near the city center of Amsterdam. And a few months before he was approached by the social organizations to take part in this social intervention, I got the chance to visit him and to talk to him. Willy told me he is always at home. He only gets out of the house to go to the grocery store or when he's picked up by the bus to go to his social workplace. When I entered his house, it struck me that all curtains were closed, which made the apartment pretty dark and damp. cramped inside. Willie explained to me that he keeps his curtains shut because of his neighbors. The sounds, the lights, the smoke his neighbors produce arouse a strong anxiety in Willie. So over the last decade, he had moved several times because of all these surrounding bad neighbors. But, as it turned out, neighbors are the same everywhere. He now knows that neighbors cannot be trusted. They will definitely take advantage of you, and they will treat you like you're worth nothing. Thus, Willie stays inside the home. He does not want to stay inside, he says, but he is forced to because of his neighbors. And because the outside world is the place where neighbors dwell, and they will bully him. At the same time, Willie craves for social contact, for friends, and for intimacy. He does not feel at home, he says, not even in the safe and private sphere of his dwelling. And the main reason for that is that he has no one who loves him. There are no friends around, there's no family in his life, and he has never had a girlfriend. And without a girlfriend, Willie says, he will never feel at home, even if he had a dozen of friends. Because then, in the end, I quote, "you're still alone," he said. With an IQ below 80, Willie explains he lacks the social skills to start social relationships. Thereby it is due to his troubled childhood and his lunatic parents, as he calls them, that he is forever deprived of feeling at home anywhere, anyway. "I don't even know what home means," he said, "because I never had one. My parents broke with their families, we moved from place to place all the time. They have cut family away from me. They stole that from me. Then they put me away in an orphanage, and now I'm always alone. And yeah, when that lasts for 365 days a year, that really makes you feel like Remy." Never referring to this classical book about Alleen op de Wereld in Dutch, or Without Family, the French book. Willie was thus completely socially isolated when I first met him. Besides his mild intellectual disabilities, he suffered from many traumas, which had resulted in a total rejection of the outside world and a deeply ingrained distrust in all human beings. Luckily, at the time, Willie received weekly professional help at home, inside his home, which, according to his own account, was not really necessary because he managed very well to live by himself. But it was the regular social contact with the professional caregivers which helped him to make it through the week. So in contrast to social contact with his neighbors, professional helpers can be sent away, Willie explained to me. That's why he's better capable of dealing with them, because when professionals treat him badly, or don't take him seriously, or force him to do things he doesn't want to do, he simply stops the help he receives from them. This is why he had already sent away several helpers and caregivers, simply because they did not expect him like he is, and they forced him to change. "This is my house," he said to me, "and here people have to comply to my rules." Thus, in contact with professional caregivers who help him at home, Willie feels in control, whereas with neighbors who seem to be out there anywhere around him, he feels fully subjected to them. And the only way to stop this hurtful feeling is to hide inside the house and keep the curtain shut. In all my encounters with respondents, the sense of control and the wish to be treated with respect and not to be judged by the outside world played a core role in a sense of home and belonging. At the same time, none of my respondents claimed that they felt fully at home in their lives or in their house because there were too many things lacking to be really at home. So apparently safety, security, control, and respect are important but insufficient conditions to account for a deep sense of home. A few weeks after my first encounter with Willie, he was called by a so-called quarter maker, which is a professional who is specialized in organizing networks of mentally disabled and psychiatric patients. So the social intervention I was following had now finally started. Craving for more social contact with professionals really allowed the quarter maker to visit him at home, just like he had allowed me to come over and talk to him. It turned out Willy was not easily persuaded to participate in the social activities presented by the quarter maker. It took several visits and over 2 months before Willy made the decision to trust this professional to step outside his house and into the neighborhood center, where the neighbors group had already started their regular meetings. The first time Willy joined was during Christmas dinner with 5 mentally disabled other residents. And Willy liked it. He didn't dare to say anything during dinner, but in the very end he made a small joke and the others laughed. A few weeks later, I observed how Willy brought a huge suitcase with a DVD player and 5 of his favorite movies to the neighbors group. He didn't speak at all, but the quarter maker introduced the night as Willy's film night. Now there were 12 men present, all in their 40s and 50s, all mentally disabled. And together they voted for the film E.T., and they watched it together in total silence. When the film had ended, Willy immediately packed his suitcase and left while mumbling, "We can do this again sometimes." It was fascinating to observe how Willy, who during our first meeting had made so clear that he could never trust neighbors, was now actively involved in a neighbors group and regularly came out of his house, his safe haven with the closed curtains, to participate in social activities. Could a top-down intervention like this really have such positive effects on a troubled and traumatized individual like Willy? I wondered how long these effects would last. Would it be possible he would become capable in the end of making friends, of engaging in social interactions on a longer term? And, as was the goal of the intervention, would the regular social support of the professional helpers become redundant in the end? I now believe the intervention was too good to be true. Because after a while, Willy and also other participants stopped attending the neighbors group. When I visited him again, he told me it had just been too much. It had been too stressful for him to participate in a group. He explained that's because it's something I haven't learned in my youth, he said. It's too hard to learn things when you're already 53 years old, where you should have learned them during your childhood. Again, he said he was doomed to stay alone and isolated forever. He never joined the group again. And recently, he told me, he now lives from day to day again, drowning himself in his hobbies and his gadgets, watching films, playing games. He wishes he could have a naked cat, though. For, as he explained while making a gesture of hugging someone, naked cats are always cold and therefore very affective. With such a pet, he would have someone who gives him love and affection. But he does not have any neighbors who can take care of the cat when he's away. If I had any nice neighbors who would look after him, Willy said, I could have this cat. But unfortunately, that's not how it is, because neighbors cannot be trusted. Willy's case is one of many examples of how attempts of the municipality and social organizations to create a sense of belonging among citizens and enhance social cohesion can work to a certain extent, but are insufficiently capable of taking into account the complex life worlds of individual citizens. The extent to which people are capable and willing to participate in local communities, to build effective relationships and to take care of each other, strongly depends on personal histories and backgrounds, but also on individual social skills and cognitive skills. Especially when it comes to the attempt to create a sense of at-homeness and belonging among fellow residents, I found that stakes are put way too high by social organizations and municipality. What home means to individuals is so personal and unique that it is sheer impossible for top-down interventions to foresee and act upon all these individual needs and differences. On the other hand, there are some general aspects of home that come to the fore in Willie's case as well as in all my other ethnographic case studies. Home is a place where one is safe, in control, and respected for who he or she is. Feeling safe, in control, and being respected, as I've tried to show, do not necessarily overlap with feeling at home. I suggest, therefore, that we can identify some basic and general aspects that shape feelings of home, but how and if home, this feeling, is fully developed is dependent on individuals' personal circumstances. It is hard to tell how and if Willie's experiences in the neighbors group will affect his idea about neighbors in general, and whether he will ever be able to build social relationships with others on the longer term. However, the top-down intervention helped Willie experience something new. The fact that he felt safe and respected for who he was in a group of neighbors, if only for a little while. I do not want to conclude by saying top-down interventions with the aim to build local communities and create a sense of home and belonging can never be successful. However, I do believe the state and social organizations involved in these interventions should become much more aware of the complexities that are at stake when attempting to build local communities. Providing short-term experiences of safety, control, and respect in local communities can affect social behavior, mutual trust, and self-confidence in modest ways. And I believe that's a lot, but at the same time I believe that's the limit of what social interventions can do. That's my presentation. Thank you.
So, my first point is that once we understand home not only as overlapping with a dwelling, but also as having to do with primarily an aspiration to attach a sense of security, familiarity, and control to some space, to tell some particular space, to carve it out from the rest, as something that looks, feels, and works out as more home-like than the rest. Now, at that point, there is no reason to understand home as only or necessarily overlapping with a dwelling, with a domestic space, as long as there is one. Home can rather be more fruitfully, we believe, understood as a matter of social relationships being tentatively negotiated and enacted towards potentially all kinds of spaces, including public ones. This is interesting, not in our view, not only for the sake of studying homemaking itself, but also because it opens up a research window on a variety of topics that have more interesting to do here with the relations with majorities and minorities, whether ethnic or of different lines, primarily in the ways of discussing what the function of the public space is, what's its degree of appropriability, how far it can work out as not only a space for transiency, for people to move wherever, but also as a source of something more intimate, meaningful, and personal for the people and the social groups being there. We are going to make this argument by working not so much on a simple distinction between the private and the public, but by arguing on one hand that there are boundaries more or less blurred between the two domains, and on the other hand that there can be a fruitful theoretical ways of approaching it through notions of thresholds of domesticity. So the idea is, rather than dividing the world between the private and the public, the domestic and the extra-domestic, a more fruitful approach can go through seeing how different people and groups are in a position of power, of orientation, of interest to approach some differential extent of the space around them, to make it more or less domestic depending on their interest, on their skills, on their powers, and on the social temporal circumstances in which they are. So, while we build on a quite basic, I would say, view of public space as any sort of place accessible for the ordinary purposes of transition, use and consumption by most people, we try to investigate how far it can be appropriated for different purposes, who the actors in a position to appropriate it are, and what the consequences are. This leads us to the debate on the boundaries of home in the relations between between all sorts of majorities and minorities. Now, a pattern that makes international migration interesting as a social phenomenon to study homemaking in the public is that it inherently denaturalizes for all inhabitants of a neighborhood what that neighborhood used to be as a traditionally home-like space to its long-term inhabitants. But it also, migration works out as a category that elicits different ways of feeling at home between the natives and the newcomers, and as far as the newcomers themselves are concerned, towards their own countries of origin. So the point is that through a home lens, we believe that we can analytically expand better on the processes whereby all sorts of public space can be identified with, appropriated with, and be brought under control by those inhabiting in them. These may have to do with how immigrant groups, as well as all sorts of minority groups, claim some space for themselves, whether for leisure purposes, as in the examples of Alejandro Miranda, or to celebrate forms of collective identity, all the more so when they are minority ones or when they tend to be stigmatized from the majority. The thing is, however, that there is not just an issue of belonging, of place attachment, if you like, of symbolic ethnicity at stake here. The thing is how the ways in which people, whatever the jargon they use, try to make themselves at home in all sorts of public space, whether a park, a street, a neighborhood, and so forth, has to do with a more fundamental search for visibility, for recognition, and for acceptance and participation, which again is something relevant for a variety of debates on the primarily urban relations between majorities and minorities. There is nothing, however, ironic, peaceful, or kind of home, sweet home discourse here. Because the ultimate point is exactly what conditions enable different people to claim a sense of home there, to feel at home in the public space, to say this is primarily our home in the public, as long as this has always the downside that whenever I feel at home in a public space, well, whatever, this tends to make it, and whenever I assert a claim for home there, this tends to make it more, actually less of a sense of home for other competing social groups being there. We also wonder, though, what are the practical ingredients, the conditions that can make a public space more or less home-like to different kind of audiences and publics. This has to do with the public infrastructures being available there, but also with the ways of which people tend over time to develop a connection and attachment there. So, but as important is to see what kind of views of home tend to shift from the private realm to the public one. So how it is that the interaction between personal, private ways of feeling oneself as in control, as familiar with space, as intimate within, can be shifted into the public or not. As important, a key delicate point is how this idea of making a public space more or less feeling like home, to the benefit of whom can or cannot be something to be pursued as a political project from policymakers of all sorts. The evidence collected so far by a number of colleagues, including some of those here, suggests that there are strong limitations to top-down policies whenever it comes to enabling people to feel more or less at home where they are, if at all, in the public sphere too. As much as for a number of intangible assets, you can think more obviously of social capital, this is not a matter of top-down political assertion, it's much a matter of how processes of dealing with neighbourhoods, of finding mutable accommodations, ways of occupying the public space can be developed or not in the public. Public authorities are more likely to have a good role as facilitators of this process in terms of development, communities, and so forth. Whenever they do have a more assertive role, this brings very much the risk that the kind of idea and sense of home to be reproduced in a public space is very much the one of the majority group, typically of the white majority group in any context. So this is something that is unlikely to work out as a source of home for the majority of people being there. Now, trying to boil down all these theoretical remarks to a more practical level, how are we going to do research on different ways in which a sense of home is claimed by some more than others, by the majorities, but also potentially by the minorities in all sorts of public space? It's our argument that we can investigate ways of making oneself at home in the public through contentious politics, through rallies, or through the simple fact of being there at the three levels by investigating in the very first place how it is that any particular public space tends to be framed as more or less home of someone, of some groups, rather than others. Here, the most obvious starting point is to see how it is that autochthonous native people, over time, over generations, are socialized to frame the space, the neighborhood, the public space where they live, as their own. There is nothing self-evident here, but there is anyway a need to deconstruct and appreciate the historical processes that lead to this finding, and also as a way to find out how malleable this framing of the homeland, but also of the city, of the neighborhood, as one's own only, can be affected and reshaped over time. An important topic connected has to do with the emotional side of home in the public, with the ways of feeling at home in the public space. Now there is a very complex issue at stake here. The important starting point for sociologists is, if I may say so, not leave emotions to psychologists only. They are too important a topic to be left to one realm of scholars only. They have a subtle but significant social import also that makes them as relevant to sociology as to many more disciplines. So the point here is to find out how some portions of public space under particular circumstances can be felt, enacted, and claimed as the home of some social groups. Think, for instance, of migrants whenever they can have social gatherings in the public spheres, festivities, celebrations, and so forth. There is not only an issue of folklore, of symbolic ethnicity here, but there is also the issue of how far enacted this kind of collective behavior turns into a claim for that public space to be also their home to some extent, and how this can be dovetailed with the competing and opposite claims for home in the public space. And actually the very key and final point has to do with how is it that people claim and social groups claim one more or less extending public space as their home only, which leads us back to the notion of domopolitics and to the need to appreciate that no matter how the notion of home sounds as emotionally warm, inclusive, protected, and so forth, it has inherently and constitutively and a downside that also talks to the exclusion, to the marginalization of all those individuals or groups that are not enough home-like in the terms of the owners or the occupiers of the home public space in itself. Now, to conclude for now, at least, the thing is, first, let us take emotion seriously, first as far as people's ways of feeling or not at all, particularly in the public space, are concerned. This is not only a matter of individuals' personal experience. This is a matter that has huge collective consequences that are not so visible maybe in the first place, but that have very much to do, I would dare claim, with the emergence of populist agendas on all kinds and of the difficulties and the struggles of traditional political stances in addressing them. Second, it's important to appreciate that home is a fundamentally ambiguous and exclusory notion. So all the political stances that explicitly invoke them, as is increasingly the case, should be taken and addressed with care and caution. As important, though, is that home in the public is not just a matter of the group of migrants playing a part of the other groups of migrants in a different place or not being able to stay there and so forth. But it has to do also with how the same public space can be constructed as more or less home-like by different targets, by different audiences, by different groups, depending on the moment, on the time, on the event built there. Exactly the circumstances where one group feels at home there do not enable others to enact the same emotion. So there's kind of a stratification of ways of making themselves at home in the public along temporal lines and not only along spatial ones. The challenge is then for sociologists in the first place, and then possibly for scholars, and then possibly for policymakers to find out mild but sensitive ways to accommodate different claims and views of home without each of them being exclusionist toward the others. At the very minimum, so the point is that whether we like it or not, home is by no means and will never be only a matter of domesticity, of bricks and mortars only. It does also have meaningful public implications. The better we make sense of them, the more important not only for a theoretical understanding of majority and minority relations, but also for the policy public making around them. That's it. Thanks.
One of the things I want to reflect upon is the question, where do we stand in the field of the study of home? Because it is a rather new and developing field, and I think that the field of the study of home really needs more attention by more people from various disciplines than it has received in the past decade. So it's really a rather new field, and we welcome very much everybody's contribution to this developing field. But I think that the papers also somewhat show that there are still quite some big questions out there. Let's start with the first observation, that I think that all three papers show that taking the original angle of home teaches us a lot about, indeed, majority-minority relations, teaches us a lot about the blurring of public and private spheres, right? So it is a way to look at phenomena you are totally used to, but the angle of home helps us to somewhat better understand what's going on. Particularly then the blurring of the public and the private, the political and the private, has been shown by these papers. When I was reading the papers, I realized that the famous feminist claim that the private or the personal or the home is political is probably more true than ever. But then in a slightly more complicated way. Because what the papers show, and let's start with Fenneke's paper, is that how the personal, how home has become more political can be a top-down affair, right? So there the private becomes politicized, and policymakers and embodied by social professionals come into the houses of people and tell them how to behave, and also that they should go outside of their home and have neighborhood bonding. But it is a top-down intervention, so it is a politicization of the private. So there is a clear blurring of the private and the political, and here the political goes into the home, into the homely sphere, as a long-term ambition. Hopefully the state eventually can withdraw, right? So social professionals are not needed anymore. But for the moment there are more social professionals entering the home than any time before in the Netherlands, and probably in more countries where welfare state reconstruction is going on. So this is how the private becomes politicized. But Alejandro shows something different. In his case, it's not the state, right, that is doing anything. Here it is what he calls everyday domopolitics, because the public sphere gets privatized. People claim a home outside of their home, right? So the movement is the other way around. So the private claims to a certain extent that they can feel at home beyond their own home. And that's part of a broader development in which we see that not only the public sphere or in terms of the neighborhood, but also cities and nations are conceptualized in terms of home, right? So there you see the privatization, to a certain extent, if you can frame it in those terms, of public entities in terms that are rather original, let's say, right? It's not self-evident at all that nations are conceptualized, or public spheres, in terms of home, but we see it happen all the time. Well, in the papers presented today, it's not so much about the nation, even though in our paper we do this. We do deal with this moving of the notion of home, the traveling of the notion of home beyond the home towards the city and the nation. But it is important to realize there is these two ways in which the political get privatized and the private gets politicized. Blurring clearly traditional boundaries between the private and the public. Coming back to the two empirical papers that deal clearly with this kind of in-between space, right? So the public realm, the public sphere, in terms of more or less the neighborhood or in the proximity of people, let's say. There, what we do see is that the two processes do not aim for the same thing. Because the top-down, so the politicization of the private, is very much aimed at mixing. At pushing people to go out and to mix with others, even though the others might be strange, and they don't want that, but it is very much like all these kind of policies are about mixing, and politicians are involved, whereas the Domopolitics from bottom up, the Ecuadorians, that's rather homogeneous, right? They want to play their play with their own people. So it's not about mixing at all. It is about affirming that that public space is yours. Well, this raises many questions, right? It raises many questions in general terms, sociological terms, like what kind of relationships are possible out there beyond your own home? Alejandro quite clearly emphasizes one term there, familiarity. I don't know whether that exactly covers, right? I mean, familiarity evidently is a necessary condition for feeling at home, but not a sufficient condition for feeling at home. So you don't say, as I understood you well, that they really wanted to feel fully at home there in public, but still there is something about what then do they want to experience, what kind of emotions do they want to experience. And Fenneke and I, we wrote an article on that, particularly in more mixed settings. The best you can hope for is amicability, if that's English. Yeah? So that's that you behave as if you are friends. You are not friends, but you have the capacity to behave as if you are friends. Right? We can develop that during the discussion, if that's interesting. But what kind of social relationships then can be experienced? And that brings us to the very fundamental question, and that shows that this is really a field in development, I would say. Brings us to the question, what then exactly is home? How is belonging experienced? And I'm not somebody who's going to give definitions now, but I think there are quite some debates among our paper presenters there. Also in terms of Domopolitics. And in the papers I think there are various answers to the question, what is home, what is belonging? Sometimes they are more descriptive, sometimes they are highly normative, which is fine, but it should be more clear, I think, why and when we use which categories. So the question is, does home have a natural home? And Fenneke says, more so in her paper than in the presentation, yes. Fenneke writes, home should remain private, which I think is a very interesting claim, quite a strong conclusion. And not exactly necessarily, as Paolo has been arguing, what people always want to do, and what Alejandro is showing, that at least some people want a home beyond their home. But I think that Fenneke has a very convincing claim, at least for her group of people she's dealing with, that all those ambitions to have home beyond home is very risky, can be extremely counterproductive. And all those social professionals treat people not as individual people, but as a category. They are going to do something with them because they have to be pushed outside of their homes. Well, this raises many specific questions. I just briefly mentioned, and you don't have to react necessarily, but are you not exaggerating the individual differences among all those clients? Is it true that professionals can never provide more tailor-made services, right? There are many things that come up in your very nice and detailed description that I was wondering about, as if it was a necessary failure, right? Whether that was the only outcome you could expect, or that there might have been a more positive version as well. But I think the main thing is for the discussion is that you have, based on a lot of your empirical research, you have a very strong claim that for Fenneke, Domopolitics is a contradictio in terminis. For her, it's impossible that politics contribute to the domos, right? You want the domos to be the domos, and not having professionals and other ones who intervene in a top-down way. Whereas Alejandro, if I read your paper well, is to a certain way far more understanding and welcoming the fact that people have this need to create a home beyond their home. But of course, at the same time, he shows how difficult that is. And that when newcomers claim a home beyond their home, the natives really have to do something. They have to make space, literally, right? And also mentally. And it is even more difficult, as you said, because it is not only the competition between natives and newcomers, but it is very much also about age, it's about gender, sexuality, class. So the more I was reading your paper, I was thinking, but why then would you think that it is possible that people have all those claims in terms of home, when it is so difficult? Because you exactly show that people cannot experience so much of a home in a context that is so competitive, because the space is so rare and resources are so scarce. So is belonging then truly belonging not too high a goal, too ambitious perhaps? And well, in the end of your paper you start writing about degrees of homeness, degrees of feeling at home, and I think that's a very productive or far more, that looks more, that takes into account the fact that when some groups feel very much at home, that jeopardizes the feeling of home for others, right? So therefore it's always to a certain degree that you can claim public home feeling. And I'm not totally convinced whether the concept of Domopolitics is very helpful there. Because what is the politics there? Well, perhaps it is the strategy, how you want to feel at home in relation to others. So the bottom-up version, as you said, but I don't know whether that's an overstretch of the concept. Then the third paper, when I was reading the paper, Paolo, and also listening to you, I thought we should be more precise about the difference between public space and public realm. But because are we dealing really about with public space and how people are fighting battles there, or do we have a far more conceptual notion of home in terms of public realm? And what you didn't mention so much, but in the paper we make a distinction between how people experience home, how people are not, or they are categorized as belonging somewhere. That's the second. And the third one is that people obviously also claim certain spaces, right? And that is a very nice analytical distinction, perhaps. But then at the same time I thought, yeah, but it's so clear, also for us it should be clear, that it is so hard to experience the emotion of home because of the fact that we are all the time categorizing people in groups and giving them space or not to experience home. There are all those competing claims, and then it boils down for me to the question, perhaps because we are scholars of home, we are a little bit over-obsessed by it. Perhaps we should think like, okay, yes, there is a lot going on in public space, but we need other notions to understand what's going on there. So today we do the angle of home, but at the same time we are somewhat undermining ourselves, I guess, because we also show that often it is not so much about the experience of home. It's about many other things than that. So I still think we have an important contribution to understanding what's going on in the public space, but we shouldn't exaggerate what we can understand in those terms. Or to make it slightly more difficult, many of the people you have been studying, many policymakers, many professionals, indeed speak the language of home in relation to the public space. But the question is whether we should then also adapt those terms as our analytical terms, right? So this is in fact my main question to all of us. Isn't it risky that we ourselves also categorize or conceptualize the public so self-evidently in terms of home, without, in these papers at least, making a clear distinction à la Bourdieu, whether those terms are categories of practice or categories of analysis, right? So is it that people speak about home, or are we analyzing what people are doing in terms, our terms, of homemaking practices? And in all three papers, I think that difference is not enough developed, so this is highly self-critical, to be clear about that. When I was rereading Fenneke's paper, I thought, well, on the one hand, there is Willy all the time, right? So Willy indeed speaks the language of home, so that's very convincing. But then suddenly you jump to the Domopolitics, and there you say, well, I do see that many policymakers, professionals, whatever, do certain things. What I call, you call, home or homemaking. Or is it that they call that themselves? And what is then the analytical, what is the contribution of using the term home? Well, there's a big risk, right? That the imic and the ethic terms are the same. And then there is we don't add anything analytically by using as scholars the term home. So there is something about the study of home in which we come too close to the object we are studying. If we don't have categories of our own. Alejandro, I think you didn't have a lot of quotes today in your paper, so I'm not sure how much the people you researched were using the term home or feeling at home or homemaking practices themselves. In your paper, it looks as if it is more, these are more categories of analysis, but they're also at risk to be such an everyday term, right? Home, homely, that the term itself looks as if we slip somewhat too much into daily life without taking enough distance and having our own conceptions out there. I'm almost done. And that perhaps also explains a little bit why we have the tendency in our papers and perhaps in this developing field to be rather normative. That we are going to tell people, yes, home should be at home and home should not be in the public space. Whereas perhaps that's not necessarily our task, right? Perhaps it's more our task to analyze how others claim some spaces as home and just leave it at that. Just leave it at what people claim and how they claim it and whether they successfully claim it or not, or what professionals are doing, instead of that we define what should be homely and what should not necessarily be homely. And that also, last remark, pertains of course then to Domopolitics, because I think that the inventor of the term really meant it as a category of analysis, right? This was really the idea that, okay, there are politics out there and those politics use the term home to be very convincing, because home is such a nice thing, right? So nobody can be against home. And belonging is even better. Feeling at home, right? It's all positive. So he used and he showed the instrumental value of home and how it is used by politicians. But that is indeed how politicians use home instead of making it into our own analytical term.
Thanks so much, Jan. Willem, I think.